Medical breakthroughs that improve lives, even save them. What progress is being made towards solving the world's biggest health problems? You're watching Roundtable with David Foster. For decades, centuries in fact, scientists have been working on cures for common deadly diseases such as cancer and Alzheimer's, among other things. Is modern technology helping to speed things up? What medical breakthroughs will this year bring?
Curing the world's ills. An ongoing struggle for the medical community. But as technology advances, so too does healthcare. Machines, apps, and robotics are helping to solve bigger medical problems faster. Are we on the brink of a new era in healthcare? 2017 was filled with encouraging medical breakthroughs. Scientists in the United States are developing a new technology called tissue nanotransfection, which could one day reprogram the body to rebuild itself. New drug combinations could delay the progression of cancers such as ovarian and breast cancer. Liquid biopsies may soon allow doctors to diagnose cancers earlier and when treatments will be most effective. Dentistry may get a little less painful after British researchers discovered that an Alzheimer's drug can lead to tooth regrowth. And there are promising developments in gene editing research.
If you think about genetic disease, it really refers to a condition that is specified by the sequence of letters in the DNA in a patient. And we now have a technology that allows correction of a sequence.
With the development of this kind of technology, diseases could be eliminated from DNA and could one day see many common and deadly ailments eradicated. But while these advances have hugely positive implications, the world's most destructive diseases, such as cancer, heart disease, and dementia, kill tens of millions worldwide each year. Is medical science moving fast enough to make meaningful change in our lifetimes?
Very pleased to say that with us at the round table today we have Zahid Latif from the Life Sciences Organization. We also have Ivan Waller, Professor of Regenerative Medicine at Aston University, and Sanjeev Krishna, Professor of Molecular Parasitology and Medicine at St George's University of London. Esteemed panel, we're going to go through an awful lot of subjects today, but let me come to you first of all, Ivan, because gene therapy was mentioned there. It's something that each one of you has mentioned when you've talked to our producers before the program. It is a very simple phrase for something that is extremely complicated in terms of the number of conditions it covers and also what it means. So can you give us the beginner's guide?
Yes, of course. So the idea of gene therapy is that we can take cells from the human body and we can remove them from the body and then change the genes within those cells. We can use technologies such as CRISPR-Cas9, and that was something referred to by Jennifer Doudna on the opening sequence. And using this sort of technology, we can very precisely remove sequences of DNA that can cause disease, and we can then replace that DNA with...
Would you have to know that there was a problem there in the first place?
You would. So you would have particular screening methods. I think a very good example of how gene therapy has been used to very good effect in the last sort of couple of years has been taking a patient's blood cells from the body, pulling out the immune cells from that blood, and then reprogramming them so that they can target and eradicate cancers that have been that are not treatable by other treatment methods.
I'd like to come back in a little while and just help me understand something, but Sanjeev, you were nodding there.
Well, I think that's CAR T type therapy, isn't it?
Right.
The chimeric T cell. These are wonderful advances in medicine. Anybody who has been watching how genetic diseases cause their problems has always wondered also if it would be possible to change that, to change the code, and the tools are now there. And I think FDA is looking to approve.
That's the Food and Drug Administration
Food and Drug
in the US.
Administration in the USA is looking to approve a gene therapy to correct an eye problem, which causes blindness prematurely. And they're going to be reviewing this in the next couple of days.
So let me try and understand this, and any one of you could jump in. Let's say one of my parents had gone blind at a certain point in their life, and therefore perhaps I was predisposed to it. That would be one way where you could step in. But what happened if they weren't predisposed to it and I suddenly started to go blind? Could you still help me with gene therapy even though there was no genetic history?
It would depend on the underlying cause of it, and it might be that because in your parents, it's a bit like the Mendelian crossing of white and purple peas. It might not have been present in each of your individual parents, but them coming together may have given you a genetic predisposition to a particular illness. It could be blindness, it could be other.
So gene therapy could be applied to different cases.
Yeah, and I think the opportunity here is very much based around actually the ability to screen individuals' genetic makeup, because it's not just your health that you could probably look at. You could also look at how that genetic makeup would match with a potential partner, and then could lead to illnesses that appear in your children. So there's multiple layers here. There's an understanding of your genetic makeup, and then what the implications are from a health perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, genetic screening is something that's becoming really sort of very sort of prevalent, and I mean, you can just sort of go on the underground today and you will see adverts for companies who will sort of take a sample of your saliva, and they can then give you back within a few weeks a readout of your sort of genetic makeup, and that will sort of tell you whether you have any predisposition to particular kinds of disease.
And where's this going to go in the next 12 months? What do you think?
Well,
not necessarily gene therapy, but in terms of sort of the advances we're making.
I think to be able to know more precisely whether it's for a cancer, the genes in that cancer, in that tumor, are going to allow response to treatment A or treatment B or neither, or whether it's, and a big problem worldwide is resistance to antimicrobial treatments, so antibiotics, for example. That's determined by genes as well. And to be able to see quickly what the resistance markers are, whether it's TB, whether it's a common skin infection, and to work out the best treatment as quickly as you need to give it, that's where I think we're going to...
Is this something that I've been reading about, also called communications diagnostics, where you can actually work out much more quickly what is the problem, and thereby work out much more quickly how best to treat it?
Yeah, I think it's let's look at it from a technological perspective. So you've got the ability to do a lot of things with computing. You've got the ability, there's a greater understanding of the biological makeup of where things go wrong, so a genetic understanding. And there's the way that I see it, there's a collision of all these technologies coming together and what people are finding are new applications for this. So the traditional approach to understanding how you keep well, how do you diagnose people, how do you treat them, and how do you follow them, how do you follow up with them, is changing because the technology is presenting all these new opportunities. Now, some of these opportunities are going to work and some of them aren't. But what scientists and clinicians are doing right now is taking these opportunities with these technologies and looking at where they might best fit.
So,
but I think the other side to this is this doesn't happen overnight, and actually to measure it in timeframes is quite difficult too. So you could sort of say, well, we've discovered this particular interesting finding, but the implications of it might not necessarily be within a year. It could be multiple years.
But I think it also demonstrates a shift in how we treat patients, because historically we've used empirical medicines. So we take a single kind of medicine and then we treat every patient who presents with a set of symptoms. Whereas what we're talking about now is stratifying patient populations and tailoring medicines to subsets of patients, perhaps who have a particular sort of genetic predisposition to something. You know, good cancers, good examples are in sort of the case of a particularly prevalent kind of breast cancer, where if the patient has a particular biomarker, a particular protein on their cells, you can target a particular therapy to them, a monoclonal antibody that will target and eradicate those cancer cells.
Wow.
And that therapy is only really effective in patients who have that particular protein on their cancer cells. So not everyone with the same, on the surface, the same kind of cancer will benefit. It's actually patients, a subset of the patients who present with a particular protein.
Can we pick, as we did in the introductory package, two particular conditions? You mentioned cancer here, so we'll come to cancer in just a moment. But in terms of Alzheimer's, because as we get an aging population, increasingly aging population, the prevalence of it is going to become greater and greater. Where do we stand at the moment in trying to understand or treat something like that?
Sanjeev, if you want to kick off.
Well, Alzheimer's is a huge challenge, because whatever you do to try and assess if you are improving Alzheimer's, the time it takes for you to get your results is going to be years. That's the nature of the condition. So it's hard to actually demonstrate benefits over a long period of time in populations. And the second challenge is that the problem is behind what's called the blood-brain barrier. So to get any new interventions, whether they're drugs or other interventions that you want to get across, you have to cross this natural barrier that is protecting the brain anyway from stuff circulating in the blood. So you've picked a hard problem. Cancers are becoming much more amenable to treatment, and we'll talk about that perhaps a bit later. But
The reason I pick Alzheimer's is because it's being discussed a great deal more. And more people are, I would imagine, concerned that it's going to turn up in their family. Now, you reckon that's going to be really hard, but with the advances that have been made over the last 10 years, and let's say particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, do you think we are getting to a stage where we can say confidently, within 20 years, we'll have sorted this out?
Not confidently, but I think we'd have taken some steps forward. I think some of the challenges associated with Alzheimer's are, it's still trying to understand what the underpinning cause of it actually is. I think the work in cancer, and actually it sort of reflects the fact of how cancer is perceived as how do you perceive any of these different diseases? So if you have an infectious disease, it's likely to kill you quite quickly. People tend to, particularly from a research perspective, there's a real focus on that because you can save lives immediately there. Alzheimer, similarly with cancer, but with Alzheimer's, it's a slow progression and a slow decline. And so there are different elements at play here. There's the poor understanding of what a lot of these dementias, how a lot of these dementias are caused. There's a difficulty in understanding the biology that underpins them, and then actually it doesn't have that immediate effect because we're only now sort of hitting this wave of what
but we
you
are,
described
as you described, a
epidemic of
new
Alzheimer's.
era of medicine.
We are, and I think this is where the starting point comes in. I think where we've seen the advances of cancer have started maybe 10, 15 years ago. So the fact that we've got things like gene therapies, these really exciting cell therapies for cancer have been based on the fact that science has been, the science was beginning to be understood 15 years ago that treatments were being created. I think with Alzheimer's, I think we're still at that sort of phase of trying to understand where the biology is, what's the underlying causes, and then we can start thinking about how do these technologies play in.
One of the problems which you may have alluded to is how long. So it's one thing to have some great ideas, to say, hey, wouldn't it be good to try this intervention or that intervention? Now, for infections, you can get your answers fairly quickly, as Zahid has mentioned. For cancers, it may take a bit longer, but it's still doable within the space of a few years. The problem is demonstrating benefits in conditions like Alzheimer's, which have a variable and slow course, and they take a long time to really manifest, and you're trying to affect those outcomes.
Are there things that we should be particularly worried about at the moment? We're talking about the positives of advances in medicine. But as medical professionals yourselves, are you looking at something and saying, look, this is a real difficulty we have at the moment?
Well, I mean, just in the case of Alzheimer's, I think the main challenge is in understanding the underlying biologic cause of the disease. Something that was mentioned in your title sequence was tissue nanotransfection. And this is an exciting technology where you could, just using a chip placed on the skin, reprogram cells, and scientists have already demonstrated that you can turn skin cells into new blood vessels and into new neurons. And you could very easily see how that technology could be used to create new neurons to treat something like Alzheimer's disease and to replace the neurons that have been lost. However, that's not going to address the underlying cause of why the neurons died in the first place. So I think our challenge still very much sort of relates to understanding the underlying disease mechanism and then trying to perhaps prevent that from ever happening in the first place.
Well, what's happened to some of the revolutionary treatments that were out and about there, say, 10, 15 years ago? For example, I've been reading a little bit about Parkinson's this week because a sports presenter I used to know very well has Parkinson's, Dave Clark. And I remember interviewing somebody about 15 years ago who had a little chip inside his brain, and when he turned a button here, it sent an electric pulse into his body, and his hands stopped shaking. And yet I don't hear about that anymore.
Well, the interesting thing on that is it's not become common practice, but also it's the technology is available and it is out there, but it's for specific patients who would benefit from that. And I think this comes back to this approach of
It's just personalised
medicine. How do you get the right treatment to the right patients? I think the second part to this is healthcare systems are inherently conservative, so therefore, rightly so. They're in the UK. They're spending taxpayers' money, and you've got to think about patient safety. So the burden of proof that's required in order to demonstrate that these things work and become common practice is quite high. And if you look at it from a commercial perspective, the companies that are developing these products have to have good access to funding and be patient, have patient investors that are going to bring these things to market, help these things come to market that the health service can buy. So I think,
and there has to be not a profit motive for them at the end of the day, but it has to make financial sense because they're not necessarily getting funded by government bodies which might be altruistic.
There are lots
it's
of reasons,
costly.
There are lots of reasons why treatments don't get out there to patients other than the fact that they don't work. So you can have treatments, as you mentioned, that may work, but there will be lots of other barriers that need to change, whether it's a change in healthcare pathways. We've always done things like this. Why do we need something new coming in, for example? Or the cost. Now, genetic treatment for some of these inherited retinal disorders, which we've just mentioned, nobody knows what the actual cost is going to be, I think, but it may be $400,000 or so a shot per eye. Mm-hmm. Now, how are we going to square that with a healthcare system which is falling apart at the seams and is managing, an upsurge of flu at the moment?
Okay, now we're getting back to basics, which is where I wanted to lead this now. Let's talk about polio. You can take your pick. Polio, let's talk about malaria, let's talk about things that affect or have affected millions in the past and in some cases still do affect millions.
My favourite disease is David, thank you. So polio is...
I know what to give it for Christmas then.
Yeah, polio is a great good news story. Smallpox, one of the first vaccines that was devised by Edward Jenner, who was at St. George's, where I work, was eradicated decades ago. And that was a phenomenal achievement by the World Health Organization and all the parties involved. Yeah. Polio is almost at that stage.
Almost. But I've been hearing almost for the last 10 years.
Yeah, but, it's a long tail.
Yeah.
And it's diminishing returns. It's that law of diminishing returns. You have got to work harder to finish off the last little bits. Yeah. So polio is a great good news story. Malaria, wow. There's some real excitement here. So
tell us.
Well, there's a new class of drug that was discovered last year, which looks very promising. But actually, it's the methodology that's improved. So you're going to love this. We are now using human infection models to study malaria and antimalarials and diagnostics and vaccines. What does this mean? We take the bug, the malaria parasite, that normally it's a mosquito that injects it into your skin and it gets into your liver. We're giving this intravenously, safely, absolutely safely, monitoring, and you've got a laboratory model in human volunteers in whom you can look at new drugs, new vaccines to see if they work, or new ways of diagnosing the disease. Now, that is going to save, and has already saved, an enormous amount of time and money. And these studies are being carried out in Tübingen, in Australia, and they're all recognized as really accelerating the development of drugs for these neglected diseases.
When it comes to your favourites in a minute.
But I'm just following on from Sanjeev. I think the interesting thing here is we've probably grown up in our medical lives thinking about the magic bullet. And I don't think that there is a magic bullet anymore. I think that, you know, the antibiotic that you would give in order to cure a particular disease, either you're getting resistance to the antibiotic or people aren't taking them the way that they should. And I think what we're recognising is the fact that the system or the service that wraps around the treatment of a patient or treatment of an individual is changing. And I think it's not just about giving a patient with malaria an antimalarial. You've got to think about, well, bed nets, particularly the WHO.
Or making the mosquitoes sterile.
On making the mosquito sterile. So, you know, the ability to genetically modify the male mosquito so it isn't able to reproduce, reduces the amount of mosquitoes that are viable and out there, helps reduce the disease as well. So it's not one magic bullet that will fix this. I think it is going to be a combination of a number of things coming together.
So, Ivan, the things that have most excited you about things that would normally affect most of us, what do you think?
Well, I think probably the cancer treatments that you know we've sort of referred to. You know, the idea that you can now treat cancers that were previously not treatable using conventional chemotherapy and radiotherapy methods. And you can sort of raise these cells that are genetically engineered to precisely target and then destroy those cancer cells. You know, and that's the sort of breakthrough that I think is going to...
While there is no magic bullet in what Zahid's saying, that is almost a magic bullet.
It's almost a magic bullet. Now, at the moment, I mean, in terms of accessibility, you know, we've already referred to cost, and the cost of these medicines, you know, we're talking about sort of $400,000 to $500,000 per treatment. And at the moment, even though there are 2 products on the market in the US, hopefully they'll be coming to Europe soon. You know, these products are for very small cohorts of patients. So typically patients who have proven unresponsive to other treatments.
And hoping for, what are you hoping for?
So I wanted to, this question
Because we don't have very much time.
All right, well, we are using antimalarials to study how we can treat cancer, because antimalarials are cheap and safe, and there is good evidence that they could work as anti-cancers. So we've got a 2-pronged world. One is high-tech, which is wonderful, high-tech, delivering precision, delivering great advances and breakthroughs. And at the same time, we've got a huge global problem. Bowel cancer, 1.1 million deaths a year. Not all of those patients, not even a fraction of them, are going to be able to access the kinds of treatments that we're discussing, which are breakthroughs. So we've got to have a 2-tiered approach to dealing with this.
Got to temper our expectations too, haven't we?
Absolutely.
I mean, we were talking about the regenerative joint. Well, human trials, this was in a dog. Human trials not for another 3 years at least, and therefore it's going to be some time before it could happen to one of us.
And that's where repurposing makes such a difference, because you've already got a drug that's being used and everyone knows about it, and you're trying to make it work in a different context. So it's not just an antimalarial, you can apply this across the board. There are things out there, there's hidden jewels, and we need to mine for them so that we can use them quickly.
And is that happening?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, yes, I mean, it is. I mean, there's multiple companies out there looking at multiple different approaches because they recognise that the market is going to be very different. You've got the US market where the healthcare insurance system can afford to pay for these really expensive treatments. But you know what? In China and India, you've got emerging middle class, but they may not necessarily be willing to pay £400,000 a treatment, but they're still looking for a treatment.
But R&D in this country is fantastic, and yet the NHS can't afford to buy these things.
And that is part of the, I suppose, how do we square the circle? because a lot of it's you can't just say that it's the cost of the R&D, because there's a lot of R&D that does lead to changes in clinical practice. I think it's these high-end treatments where there's a greater investment at the front end because it takes longer to develop, which means that you need a bigger return. But to pick up on something that Sanjeev said, I think
I'm going to have to ask you to be brief.
I will be brief. The early detection elements of how do you detect cancer earlier, how do you detect infectious diseases earlier, mean that you could use the treatments that are currently available in a different way that allows you to manage people to prevent them getting these really nasty
You all went into medicine hoping to help. It must be very depressing sometimes when you see that you can't help. But what is fascinating for me sitting around this table today is to see the excitement that each one of you has when looking to the future, and the advances that have been made in perhaps not an imaginary future. I'm reminded of the words from an imaginary future: live long and prosper. And I hope that's what happens to many of you during 2018. From me, David Foster, and the team at the Roundtable, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.